Hi, it's Dan, and in this video I'm going to talk about Central Row. That's the street that's just south of the old State House in Hartford, Connecticut, and just east of Main Street. It's dominated today by two skyscrapers that were built in the 1920s, but it has a long and interesting history. The history of Central Row goes back to the earliest days of Hartford in the 1630s. Looking at this map that depicts the early property holders, the area where the old State House is today was called Meeting House Yard. The southern portion of that was the early town's marketplace, and south of that, where Central Row is today, was the property of Clement Chaplin. He was an early settler of Hartford, but he didn't stay long and quickly moved to Wethersfield. There's a connection here with the Webde Stevens Museum in Wethersfield because those historic houses were built where earlier Chaplin had his property in town. Recent archaeological work at the museum uncovered evidence of a wooden palisade wall that would have protected Chaplin's home around the time of the Pequot War. Returning to Central Row in Hartford, here's a reconstructed view made in 1886 of what it may have looked like about 60 years earlier. So on the left is the old State House, which is of course still there today. And remember, in that map I just showed, there was an area called Marketplace. Well, it continued to be a marketplace. And there's a building here that's actually labeled Market. And it's just behind this, looking due east, that the Phoenix building, the boat building, is today. And then just to the right is, of course, the buildings of Central Row. And according to the label, at the east end of Central Row are two dwellings. Well, we know that one of these dwellings was the home of Dr. Roderick Morrison, built in 1750. And this would have stood near the end of the row, but in the 1820s, it was purchased by Henry L. Ellsworth, who was developing a lot of property in Hartford at the time. And he moved it south. So he moved it a lot south so that it would be on Prospect Street, so that in its place he could build a new commercial building, which was known as the Ellsworth Block. So he built that in 1829. And it would last until the late 1930s, so over a century, although it would be altered over those years. And then the next building labeled is called Fox's Building, and next to that is the Universalist Church. This was the first independent Universalist church built in 1824. And it was remodeled in 1833 to have actually retail space on the first floor. And it was eventually demolished in 1860 to make way for a building called the Marble Block. Now here's a view from the Smith's map of Hartford County of 1855, and it does in fact show the steeple of the Universalist Church as it looked at that time. And when it was torn down in 1860, the church moved to a new building on Main Street, and eventually it would move out to West Hartford, where it's now the Universalist Church of West Hartford. And then next to that is a building labeled U.S. Branch Bank. This is actually a branch of the Bank of the United States, the very bank that Andrew Jackson famously went after. And then the final building on the row along Main Street is labeled Times Building and Museum. Well, this would have been, for a time, the home of the Hartford Times newspaper, and for a while it was also the home of what was called the Hartford Museum. This began years before. It was actually in the old State House, and it was called the Museum of Natural and Other Curiosities. And by this point, it had moved to what was called the Central Row Building, and this building on the corner was actually also developed by Henry Ellsworth. Now we jump ahead to a much later view from 1880. And some of the same buildings are still there that were represented in the previous view. The Ellsworth Block is still there, and a little bit after the time this picture was taken, there would be some changes in that building, as you can see here on the right. This is from a much later postcard view. And the building was enlarged. It actually contained the Elks Hall until their new building was built in 1903 on Prospect Street. So the old hall would then have other tenants. And that hall later was called Central Labor Union Hall, and there was an Eagles Hall in there as well. So that building, as I mentioned, would continue in existence in pretty much the form on the right there until the late 1930s. But this building was also famous for having the Marble Pillar restaurant, which existed from 1860 until 1993. So actually that restaurant started out in this old building, and when it was replaced in the late 30s, it continued in the new building that's still there today until the restaurant went out of business in 1993. And next to that is another small building. And next to that is the lot where the Universalist Church had been, and that was replaced in 1860 by Robinson's Marble Block. And this was the second marble-fronted building in the city of Hartford after the earlier Phoenix Bank of 1817. And Robinson had earlier built the block right next door, in this case using brownstone. And this block, built around 1850, is the one building in Central Row that is still there today. So that's a long-lasting building, and it has gone through some changes, particularly the first floor was later made a lot grander. But the upper floors with the brownstone and the windows are still the same, as well as that cornice is the same as it was way back in 1850. And the building on the end, where the Hartford Museum and Hartford Times had been located, that building that Ellsworth had developed was torn down around 1855 and replaced by what was known as the Hungerford Cone Building. It was designed by the architect Octavius Jordan. Hungerford and Cone were lawyers, and the building was known for having many lawyers' offices in there, as well as other businesses. This building was purchased by the Hartford Trust Company in 1869, and then that company merged with the Connecticut Trust Company in 1919 to form the Hartford-Connecticut Trust Company. And that was the company that demolished the Hungerford and Cone Building in 1920 and replaced it with the skyscraper that is still standing there today. So that was finished in 1921. That was at the start of the decade, but at the end of the 20s, the neighboring Travelers Insurance Company demolished the Marble Block and the building just east of that and replaced them with a skyscraper as well, finished in 1928. So that completed the erection of the two skyscrapers that still dominate Central Row today. Looking at the lower floors of these buildings, you'll notice that the base section of the Hartford-Connecticut Trust Company building on the right exactly matches the height of the earlier building that Robinson had built in 1850. So the architect was acknowledging the earlier building being there and continuing the row on street level. The 1850 building then also had its own first floor, made more grandiose with arches, kind of matching the Hartford-Connecticut Trust Company building. So there's kind of an interesting dialogue going on between these two buildings, one of the 1850s and the other of the 1920s. As I mentioned before, the final change to Central Row came at the end of the 30s when the old Ellsworth Block was torn down and replaced by the modern building that's there today. And that completed pretty much the buildings along Central Row as we see them now. So if you enjoyed this video, you can read more about these and other Hartford buildings that are long gone in vanished downtown Hartford Also, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I would greatly appreciate it. You can also hit the like button, and you can also visit my website, historicbuildingsct.com. Thank you.